There are not many moments in the history of American organized crime that can be reduced to a single image with this economy. A young man seated at a table in a federal courtroom, composed and deliberate, looking across the room at the older man who had made him everything he was, and preparing to speak the words that would end that man's life in the only way that still mattered. The man at the defense table was not large. He had never been large. 5 feet 5 inches. Not a frame that would draw a second look in any room. A man you could walk past in any neighborhood without registering him at all. But Nicodemo Scarfo had made himself one of the most feared bosses in the history of the American Mafia through a method that was simple in conception and catastrophic in consequence. He killed more people than anyone thought a mob boss could kill and survived the aftermath. His organization ordered approximately 30 murders in 4 years. He was personally convicted of participating in 8 of them. He had ordered the killing of his own godson. He had built an empire on the bones of men who had trusted him, and he had raised a boy from childhood to be the most loyal instrument in that empire. The boy was now 36 years old. He was sitting at another table in the same courtroom. He had been made underboss of the Philadelphia crime family at 31, the youngest man to hold that position in the history of the American Mafia. He had been raised in his uncle's household. He had killed for his uncle. He had done everything that had ever been asked of him, and he had decided to testify. The man at the defense table was Nicodemo Scarfo. The man about to speak was his nephew. This is the story of what was built between them, what it cost, and why it could not hold. Drop where you are watching from in the comments below. It is genuinely one of the best parts of doing this. And if you are new here and want more history like this delivered straight to you, subscribe now. Back to South Philadelphia in the 1970s, and the world that existed before the peace was broken in a way that nobody inside the organization was prepared for. South Philadelphia in the 1970s carried the atmosphere of a neighborhood that had decided to hold still while the rest of the century moved on without it. The row houses and social clubs and corner stores operated along rhythms established decades earlier, and the men who ran the informal economy of illegal gambling and loan sharking and labor union influence had been running it long enough that they were simply part of the landscape. They were not hidden, exactly. They were present in the way that a neighborhood learns to accommodate certain permanent features, as unremarkable as the church on the corner or the diner where particular men occupied particular tables every morning at the same time. This was the world that Angelo Bruno had built, and by the late 1970s he had been building it for more than 2 decades. Bruno had become the boss of the Philadelphia crime family in 1959, and over the years that followed, he developed a governing philosophy that separated him from almost every other boss of his era: restraint. He avoided violence not because he was incapable of authorizing it, but because he understood what violence produced. It drew attention. Attention drew investigations. Investigations produced convictions. The mathematics were not complicated. A boss who killed people he could have managed differently was a boss making the most expensive possible decision with his organization's survival. He built the Philadelphia family around gambling and loan sharking and labor union influence, the traditional revenues that had been embedded in the neighborhood economy long enough to generate relatively little federal scrutiny. He refused to sanction narcotics trafficking, a decision that cost him the loyalty of men who believed the drug trade was the most profitable criminal market of the era, and that his refusal was denying them what they were owed. He maintained stable relationships with the New York families without subordinating Philadelphia to them. He resolved disputes at the table rather than in the street. He ran a city, more or less, and he ran it with a minimum of the visible carnage that characterized less disciplined organizations in other cities. The men who called him the Gentle Don or the Docile Don were not expressing affection. They were expressing a frustration that had been accumulating for years. They believed his patience was weakness. They believed his restraint was cowardice. They believed that the family's refusal to enter the narcotics trade had left a generation of subordinates less wealthy than they should have been, and that his long tenure had produced stability at the cost of ambition. A man who ran an organization for 21 years without catastrophic federal intervention, had accomplished something that virtually no one else in his era managed. The men around him mostly experienced it as evidence that he was not moving fast enough. By the time the 1970s were ending, those strains were becoming visible in the organization's daily operations. Men who had spent years watching Bruno decline certain revenues believed they were being cheated of what the organization could otherwise generate. Atlantic City's gambling economy was in the early stages of a transformation that Bruno had not fully positioned the family to exploit, and Bruno himself was 69 years old, a man whose careful leadership had produced 2 decades of relative peace, and whose long tenure had also produced a generation of subordinates who had been waiting, with diminishing patience, for something to change. He had also made a decision years earlier that would only reveal its full consequences in retrospect. He had sent a man to Atlantic City as punishment. He had not considered what Atlantic City was about to become. Nicodemo Domenico Scarfo was born on March 8th, 1929, in Brooklyn, but it was South Philadelphia that made him. His family settled in the neighborhood before he was old enough to understand what the city was, or what it would require of the people who lived inside its particular culture, and he grew up in a world where the organization was not something you discovered from outside, but something you encountered from birth, already operating, already embedded, already offering a specific set of lessons to a boy who was paying attention. He was not large, and would never become large. 5 feet 5 inches was his physical ceiling, and he was acutely aware of it in the specific way that men of small stature become aware of such things when they operate in an environment where physical presence carries professional value. The awareness produced a response. The response was ferocity, so total and so immediate that his physical dimensions ceased to be relevant to anyone who dealt with him directly. He compensated for what he was not through what he was willing to do, and what he was willing to do was not restrained by the considerations that limited other men. He entered the Bruno organization through the standard sequence of activities for a young man in South Philadelphia with criminal ambitions and the right connections: bookmaking, debt collection, the small-scale operations that served as both an income and an audition for more serious responsibilities. He established himself as reliable. He was inducted as a formal-made member of the family in 1954 at 25 years old, following several years of demonstrated operational usefulness. In the years that followed his induction, he handled assignments that required a man who would do what the organization needed without creating secondary problems that required additional management. He served prison time. He returned each time with his standing intact or enhanced, because in the culture that defined his world, a man who went to prison without cooperating with authorities was a man who had demonstrated the most valued quality available. He accumulated the kind of track record that, in a disciplined organization, was supposed to produce steady advancement over time. What he could not demonstrate across any sustained period was the capacity to subordinate his personal volatility to the requirements of the organization in every situation, under every provocation, regardless of how minor or avoidable the original cause. The temperature problem that would eventually define his career was not invisible to the men above him. It manifested in interactions that forced the organization to absorb consequences it would not otherwise have had to deal with, consequences that arose not from strategic decisions or organizational conflicts, but from personal volatility in settings where restraint was the only appropriate response. Bruno knew what he had in Scarfo. He valued what was usable. He managed what was not. The knowledge was a liability he accommodated rather than a strength he fully deployed. He had placed Scarfo in positions where the usefulness was extractable and the volatility was, at least theoretically, containable. For a time this arrangement produced acceptable results, then it did not. The incident that redirected everything was not dramatic in any organizational sense. It was a dispute over a seat. Scarfo entered the Oregon Diner in South Philadelphia in 1963 and found a 24-year-old longshoreman sitting in the booth he considered his preferred table. An argument developed. Scarfo produced a knife. The longshoreman did not survive the encounter. The killing was not authorized. It was not organizational business. It was not a message being delivered at the direction of a superior or a problem being resolved for the benefit of the enterprise. It was personal volatility, producing a lethal result over something that any other man in the organization would have handled without incident or simply not noticed at all. Scarfo pleaded guilty to manslaughter and served a prison sentence of several months. When he returned to the streets of South Philadelphia, he found that the organization had made a decision about him in his absence. Angelo Bruno sent him to Atlantic City. The posting carried the specific texture of a formal consequence, a judgment delivered without words, but understood completely by everyone who observed it. You are not the kind of man we can have operating at the center of things. South Philadelphia was the center. The labor halls and the numbers operations and the relationships that governed how business was conducted on both sides of the Delaware River were the center. Atlantic City was something else. It was 40 miles away and several levels of organizational significance below what mattered, a peripheral outpost that required enough attention to maintain and not enough to justify the assignment of anyone who had real organizational value. Atlantic City in 1963 was a resort town that had seen its best decades already. The democratization of leisure travel had stripped it of the exclusive clientele that had built the boardwalk economy. The grand hotels were beginning to show their age. The city that had once been the playground of the eastern seaboard was becoming cheaper and shabbier with each passing season, a place that the demographics of American vacation taking had largely bypassed. George Anastasia, the journalist who would spend years covering the Philadelphia family, described the posting with precision. It was, he said, like sending Scarfo to Siberia. Scarfo moved into a small apartment at 26 South Georgia Avenue in the neighborhood called Ducktown, the Italian enclave in Atlantic City, where immigrants had settled a generation earlier and built the service infrastructure that kept the resort running. He ran bookmaking and loan sharking. He maintained the family's modest presence in the local labor operations. He built a network of associates in a territory that nobody in South Philadelphia was paying much attention to, because there was nothing in Atlantic City worth the attention of anyone who had alternatives. He had been told, without those words being spoken, that this was where his career would resolve itself, quietly and without consequence, in a city that was quietly resolving itself in the same way. He ran his small operation. He waited. And then New Jersey did something that nobody in South Philadelphia, including Angelo Bruno, had fully anticipated. New Jersey voted to legalize casino gambling in 1976, and the city that had been Nicky Scarfo's punishment became, almost overnight, the most valuable territory in the eastern criminal landscape. The first casinos opened in 1978. What followed was one of the largest concentrated construction projects on the eastern seaboard in a generation. Hotels and gaming floors and parking structures and all of the physical infrastructure that a new industry requires were going up across Atlantic City at a pace that demanded concrete and labor and supply chains and union cooperation and building inspection and permits and all of the mechanisms through which an embedded criminal organization extracts money from legitimate economic development. The construction budgets ran to hundreds of millions of dollars. The permanent workforce that the casinos would employ numbered in the tens of thousands. The amount of money flowing into and through Atlantic City in the late 1970s and early 1980s was extraordinary, and it was flowing into a city where Nicky Scarfo had been the family's representative for 13 years. He knew every contractor, every union representative, every city official, every businessman trying to navigate the new economy. He had spent a decade and a half developing exactly the relationships that were now worth an extraordinary amount. His concrete company poured concrete for a substantial portion of the early casino construction, embedding the organization's financial interest in the physical foundations of the buildings going up across the city. His organization controlled Local 54, the hotel employees and restaurant employees union, which represented the workers inside the casinos once they opened. He shaped construction contracting through connections that predated the casino era and that gave him influence at every level of how building decisions were made. What had been a punishment had become a competitive advantage so significant that it reshaped the entire internal hierarchy of the Philadelphia family. A man who had been placed in Atlantic City because Bruno considered him a liability had spent the years of his banishment developing exactly the infrastructure that the casino economy required. He had not built it for this purpose. It had simply been there, already in place, already his when the purpose arrived. By the end of the 1970s, Scarfo controlled territory that the rest of the organization had underestimated at the moment he was sent there and could not fully access now that it mattered. The Exile had placed him exactly where he needed to be. The empire he had assembled from banishment was about to require a second in command who already knew every part of it. That person had been growing up in the same Ducktown neighborhood, inside the same household, absorbing the same values from the same man, for as long as the Exile had been running. Philip Leonetti was Scarfo's nephew by blood and his heir by design. He was born on March the 27th, 1953, in Philadelphia, the son of Annunziata Scarfo, Nicky's sister. His father abandoned the family when Leonetti was a child, an absence that created a vacancy his uncle moved to fill with the same directness he brought to every other organizational problem he identified. What Leonetti needed was a father. What Scarfo had was a nephew, with no one else to model himself on. The arrangement that resulted was not accidental, and was not left to chance. Leonetti grew up in the Ducktown compound where Scarfo lived and operated. He grew up alongside Scarfo's own children. He absorbed the organization's values, not as an outsider who encountered them later and chose to adopt them, but as a child who had no prior framework to compare them against. The world his uncle described was the world as it existed. The organization his uncle ran was not separate from daily life. It was daily life. The structure through which relationships were managed and money was made and disputes were resolved and loyalty was enforced. At 8 years old, Scarfo placed the boy in the front passenger seat of a truck that had just been used in a murder and drove through the city. Leonetti was there to make the vehicle look like ordinary family transportation. A man driving through town with a small child beside him did not look like a man trying to dispose of a vehicle connected to a killing. He looked like a man running an errand with his nephew. The decoy worked. Leonetti was 8 years old, and his uncle had already found a use for him. He attended Holy Spirit High School in Atlantic City and was, by the accounts of those who knew him in those years, a standout point guard on the basketball team. He attended daily mass. He was quiet and reserved in a way that made him seem, to the people who observed him, almost the opposite of his uncle in temperament. He was offered other paths. His mother pleaded with him to take them. He had the ability and the record to pursue a different kind of life, and the people who cared about him told him so repeatedly. He declined. The world his uncle had built was the world he intended to inhabit. By the time he was a young adult, that decision had been made in everything except its formal documentation. He killed for the first time in 1976. He was 23 years old. 3 years later, in 1979, he killed a man named Vincent Falcone on his uncle's orders. He was inducted as a formal-made member of the Philadelphia crime family in a ceremony conducted in 1980. He was 26 years old. He had already killed twice by the time the oath was administered. What the oath meant, in the context of the life he had been raised to live, was not a transformation. It was a formalization. He had been inside the organization, in every meaningful sense, since he was 8 years old. The ceremony placed documentation on what already existed. He was now, officially, what he had always been raised to become, a soldier in the most literal sense of that term, loyal to one man above all others, prepared to do what that man required, and committed to a set of values that placed the organization above every other claim on his conduct. He was 26 years old. He had already killed 2 people. The evening of March 21st, 1980, ended a 21-year era in Philadelphia criminal history in the span of a single gunshot. Angelo Bruno was sitting in the front passenger seat of his car outside his home on Snyder Avenue in South Philadelphia after dinner. He was 69 years old. He had spent 2 decades building the most stable criminal organization on the eastern seaboard outside New York. He was shot through the passenger window of the car. He died at the scene. The murder had been organized by Antonio Caponegro, a senior figure in the family who had concluded, by his own calculation, that Bruno's removal would be accepted retroactively by the Commission once the result was in place. His calculation was catastrophically wrong. Weeks after Bruno's death, Caponegro's body was found in the trunk of a car in New York City. He had been tortured. Money had been stuffed into his wounds. The symbolism was direct and intentional. A man who had killed a boss for financial ambition would be answered with a punishment that made his own motivation the instrument of his death. The Commission had not approved the murder and would not retroactively endorse it, and the penalty it administered was designed to ensure that no one else in any family would attempt the same calculation. The New York families appointed Philip Testa as the new boss. Testa had been Bruno's underboss and was known as the Chicken Man, a name derived from his involvement in the poultry business that stood among his legitimate commercial interests. Scarfo was named consigliere under Testa. Pete Casella was underboss. Testa was not in the position long enough for his governing philosophy to be tested against anything substantial. Less than 12 months after Bruno's murder, on March 15, 1981, a nail bomb packed with roofing nails was detonated under the front porch of his South Philadelphia home. The explosion was powerful enough that neighbors reported believing a factory had blown up. Philip Testa was returning home in the early morning hours. He reached his front door. The bomb detonated. He died from his injuries shortly after. Pete Casella had organized the murder. When Testa was dead, Casella moved to claim leadership, asserting to anyone who would listen that the Commission had approved his succession. Scarfo made a different move. He traveled to New York and met with the heads of the Genovese and Gambino families, the two most powerful members of the Commission with interests in Philadelphia's territory. He established without ambiguity that no such approval had been given. Casella had no authorization. The Commission had not been consulted. The Commission appointed Scarfo as boss. Casella was banished from the organization and left for Florida. The man Angelo Bruno had sent to Atlantic City as a disciplinary measure, the man who had been running a token outpost while the real organization operated 40 miles away, and 2 levels of importance above him, had returned from that posting as the boss of the family that Bruno had built and Testa had briefly inherited. The exile was over. What came next would be defined entirely by what Scarfo believed a criminal organization was for and how it should be run. What he believed was not complicated, and what he did with the authority he had just received was going to answer, definitively, whether his belief was correct. What Nicodemo Scarfo believed about criminal leadership could be stated simply: loyalty required consequences, and consequences required bodies. He did not govern the way Bruno had governed, through patience and the careful calibration of organizational benefit against risk. He governed through the active administration of fear, through a system in which the penalty for perceived disloyalty was death, and the only protection against that penalty was complete and visible submission to his authority at every moment and in every interaction. The body count during the first 4 years of his tenure was approximately 30 members and associates of the Philadelphia criminal world. This number had no precedent in the family's history. Other organizations had produced internal conflicts and periodic violence, but the sustained rate at which Scarfo's organization eliminated its own people across this period was not something that any previous Philadelphia boss had approached. The killings were not all connected to a single conflict or a single enemy. They were the product of a governing philosophy applied consistently and without the strategic restraint that might have moderated the rate of its application. The conflict that produced the largest single share of the documented violence was the war with the Ricoban faction. Harry Ricoban was a family member past 70 years old who controlled gambling operations with roots going back decades, and who represented the kind of entrenched independent interests that Scarfo's approach to leadership could not accommodate. Ricobene's faction challenged Scarfo's authority, and eventually produced an open internal conflict with documented killings on both sides. Frank Monte, the family consigliere, whom Scarfo had himself named to the position, was killed by the Ricoben faction in May of 1982, shot outside his car in South Philadelphia by a Ricobene associate. The murder was a direct challenge to the hierarchy Scarfo had established. The act of violence that most precisely illustrated the atmosphere Scarfo had created occurred on March 15th, 1982, the first anniversary of Phil Testa's death. Rocco Marinucci was the man who had physically built and planted the nail bomb that killed Testa, connected to Pete Casella's conspiracy, and a target for Salvatore Testa, Phil's son, from the moment of his father's death. Marinucci was located in a South Philadelphia parking lot. He was shot to death. His killers left firecrackers stuffed in his mouth. The choice of the anniversary was deliberate. The specific detail of the firecrackers was deliberate. Sal Testa was communicating something about the patience and the precision with which he intended to settle every account connected to his father. Harry Ricobene survived an assassination attempt that should have killed him, was wounded in subsequent incidents, and was eventually convicted and imprisoned on charges that removed him from the conflict. His faction was eliminated. Scarfo had won the internal war by the standards available to him. His enemies were dead, imprisoned, or expelled from the organization. What winning had cost was harder to measure but visible in how the organization operated afterward. The men around Scarfo had watched what he did to people who challenged him. They had also watched what he did to people he merely suspected of developing too much independent standing. There was no defined threshold within the organization between safe and dangerous, because the threshold appeared to shift according to Scarfo's assessment of the threat any individual represented at any given moment. The uncertainty was itself a tool. A man who cannot determine what qualifies him for elimination will tend to remain as visible and as loyal and as close to the boss as possible at all times. This was, by design, exactly how Scarfo wanted his organization to function. By the middle of 1984, the organization that had operated under Bruno's careful restraint for 2 decades had become something Bruno would not have recognized. Scarfo had built a machine for eliminating people who were in his way, or who might one day be in his way, or who he believed might become a problem before the problem fully materialized. He was about to use it on the one man in the organization who nobody thought he would touch. Salvatore Testa had been formally inducted into the Philadelphia crime family in 1980, the same year as Leonetti, and in the years immediately following his father's death, he had become the most effective and most feared figure in Scarfo's operation. His father had been the boss. Nicodemo Scarfo, now the boss himself, had been his godfather since birth. He had the pedigree of a family son and the track record of a man who had demonstrated his capabilities in the most direct way available to him repeatedly across the bloodiest years of the family's recent history. He was known among those in the organization as the crowned prince of the Philadelphia mob. The nickname was an assessment rather than a courtesy. He rose to capo and then to the position of acting underboss as the internal structure of the family evolved through the violent years of the early 1980s. He had carried out more than 15 murders on Scarfo's behalf. He was the most reliable enforcer the family had produced in a generation. He had been described by associates during the Ricobene conflict as effectively unkillable, an assessment based on documented evidence. In June of 1982, he took 8 shotgun rounds to his body at close range outside a South Philadelphia pizza restaurant during an assassination attempt connected to the Ricobene War. He survived. His attackers were arrested when their car struck a utility pole during the escape. He survived a second attempt not long after. A third attempt was made and failed. The men around him began to treat his survival as something beyond ordinary luck, a quality that set him apart from the men who died in the same period around him. He was not unkillable. He was 27 years old when those attempts were made, and he was 28 when he ran out of time. What had changed was Scarfo's perception of him, a man who had survived repeated assassination attempts, who had carried out more violence than anyone else in the organization over the previous 3 years, who had the organizational credibility of his father's legacy and his own track record, who was respected by soldiers and captains across the family at a level that had begun to approach the regard in which Scarfo himself was held, had become, in Scarfo's reading of the situation, a potential rival rather than an asset. The paranoia that characterized Scarfo's leadership had reached the point where demonstrated capability was itself a risk factor. A man who was too good at what he did, too respected by too many people, was a problem to be managed before it became a problem that could not be managed. The setup was arranged by the people closest to Testa. Joseph Pungitore, a member of his own crew and someone he trusted without reservation, arranged for them to meet at a location in the fall of 1984. Salvatore Grande was waiting inside with a silenced pistol. Testa walked in. He greeted Grande. He began to talk with Pungitore. Grande drew the weapon from beneath a cushion and shot Testa in the back of the head. He shot him again. Salvatore Testa died on September 14th, 1984. His body was found alongside a road in Gloucester Township, New Jersey. He was 28 years old. He was the 23rd mob murder since Angelo Bruno's assassination. He was Nicodemo Scarfo's godson. Scarfo had ordered the murder of his own godson, the young man he had treated as a son alongside Leonetti, the most capable and most valuable figure in the organization, killed in the back room of a candy store by members of his own crew because his capabilities had made him too significant to leave in place. The message that Testa's murder delivered to everyone remaining in the organization required no interpretation. If the crowned prince of the Philadelphia mob, the man who had been Scarfo's godson since birth, who had survived being shot 8 times and 2 additional assassination attempts, who had carried out more than 15 murders for the boss, could be eliminated without warning, in a location he had been brought to by someone he considered a friend, then there was no position in the organization, and no relationship with Scarfo that offered reliable protection. The men around Scarfo absorbed this understanding into everything they did from that moment forward. Philip Leonetti, now 31 years old, was elevated to the position of Underboss following Testa's removal, becoming the second most powerful man in the Philadelphia crime family and the youngest underboss in the history of the American Mafia. He understood what had happened to Testa. He had understood it before it was done. He understood what it meant for anyone who operated inside the organization, including himself. He was closer to Nicodemo Scarfo than any other person in the world. He was also the person who knew, with the completeness that only someone raised in the same household from childhood can know another person, exactly what Scarfo had become. Behind the violence that defined the Scarfo era in every newspaper account and federal indictment of the period was an economic operation of considerable sophistication, and it was centered on the city that had once been considered too peripheral to matter. Atlantic City in the 1980s was generating revenue at a scale that had exceeded any projection made at the time of legalization, and the mechanisms through which Scarfo and Leonetti extracted money from that revenue were embedded deeply enough in the construction and labor infrastructure that they had become structural features of how the casino economy functioned. The concrete company poured concrete for a substantial portion of the early casino construction in Atlantic City. The organization's control of Local 54, the Hotel Employees and Restaurant Employees Union, gave it influence over the terms on which the new casino workforce was employed, the contracts under which workers operated, and the relationships between casino management and the organized labor structure through which tens of thousands of positions were governed. Construction contracts across the Atlantic City development were shaped by the organization's influence over which bidders received which assignments and at what prices. The money moved through multiple channels, some of it in plain sight within the legal economy, and some of it embedded in arrangements that required investigative work to trace. The extortion operations extended beyond Atlantic City. Scarfo's organization demanded payment from businesses and developers who needed organizational approval to operate in territories the family controlled. One such operation involved a developer who sought to build a project along the Delaware River waterfront in Philadelphia and who was informed that a payment of $1 million, routed through a Philadelphia city councilman who would take his portion and pass the remainder to Scarfo's organization, was the cost of proceeding. The arrangement was documented by federal investigators. In 1987, Scarfo was convicted of conspiracy to commit extortion in that case and sentenced to 14 years. The city councilman was convicted in the same proceeding. It was the first conviction of the series that would end Scarfo's freedom permanently. The FBI investigation had been running for years by that point, accumulating a record of documented criminal activity that stretched across the full scope of what he had built. Wiretaps had captured conversations in social clubs and meeting locations where murder orders and extortion arrangements and organizational decisions were discussed with the operational specificity that investigators needed to build prosecutable cases. Physical surveillance had documented the relationships and the meetings. Financial records had established the money flows and the mechanisms of distribution. And the men who had been inside the organization, who had participated in the violence and the extortion and the governance of a criminal enterprise that had killed approximately 30 people across 4 years, were beginning to make calculations of their own. In 1987, Scarfo was convicted and sentenced to 14 years for the waterfront extortion. The FBI was not finished. The federal case against the Scarfo organization was assembled through a combination of surveillance technology and human intelligence that reflected the full range of investigative tools that law enforcement had developed through the 1980s for use against organized crime. Wiretaps placed in locations where the organization conducted its business captured conversations that established, in the subject's own words and at their own level of operational specificity, what the organization was doing and who was directing it. Physical surveillance documented relationships and meetings. The RICO statute provided the legal framework to charge the organization as a criminal enterprise rather than pursuing individual defendants for individual criminal acts, which meant that the pattern of violence and racketeering across the full period of Scarfo's tenure could be presented to a jury as what it was: a systematic program of criminal governance run by one man for organizational purposes. The human intelligence came in the form of 5 members of Scarfo's organization who decided to cooperate with the government. Nicholas Carmandi was a soldier who provided detailed accounts of murders he had participated in and orders he had received directly from the boss. Eugene Milano, another soldier, did the same. Thomas Del Giorno was a capo who turned informant and provided information from higher in the organizational structure than the soldiers could access. Lawrence Merlino, also a capo and the brother of Scarfo's longtime close associate, Salvatore Merlino, became a government witness and added his own level of operational detail to the record that investigators had been constructing. And Philip Leonetti, the underboss, the nephew, the man who had been raised from childhood to be Scarfo's most trusted and most indispensable instrument, who had killed 10 people in service of that role, who had risen to the highest position in the organization, agreed to cooperate. On November 19, 1988, Nicodemo, Scarfo, and 16 associates were convicted on more than 32 counts of racketeering. The counts included 8 murders, 4 attempted murders, loan sharking, 14 extortions, and drug trafficking. In May of 1989, Scarfo was sentenced to 55 years in federal prison. A separate state conviction for the murder of Frank D'Alfonso, a bookmaker killed in July of 1985, added a life sentence. He was 59 years old. The mathematics of what had just been done to him required no interpretation. Philip Leonetti was 36 years old when he made the decision that would define the second half of his life. He had been charged alongside the others, convicted on racketeering and murder counts, and sentenced to 45 years. 45 years for a man who was 36. He had been raised from childhood to understand what loyalty meant in the organization his uncle ran. He had killed 10 people in service of that loyalty. He had risen to the highest position available to him. He had done everything that had ever been asked of him, and he was looking at 45 years. The decision he made was not a transaction, whatever it might appear to be from outside. It was not simply the exchange of information for a reduced sentence, though that was the legal structure of what occurred. It was something more complete. a man who had watched Nicodemo Scarfo order the murder of his own godson, who had watched the organization destroy men, who had given it everything they had, who had understood since September of 1984 what the organization was and what remaining inside it ultimately meant, deciding that the values he had been raised to hold above all other considerations were no longer sufficient reason to accept the consequence of holding them. He cooperated. What he gave the government was extraordinary in scope. He testified at approximately 15 trials across federal and state courts over the years that followed his decision. He provided detailed insider accounts of the organizational structure of the Philadelphia family, the specific murders that had been authorized and carried out, the mechanisms of extortion and racketeering that had generated the family's revenue, and the decision-making processes through which Scarfo had directed the enterprise across the years of his tenure. His testimony confirmed and extended the cases built on the wiretap evidence. It filled the evidentiary gaps that the surveillance record had left open. It provided the organizational context that physical evidence alone cannot supply. His contribution to the prosecutions that followed resulted in the convictions of more than 50 defendants. The reach of his testimony extended well beyond Philadelphia. Information he provided was used in prosecutions connected to figures in New York, including testimony that played a role in cases against John Gotti and Vincent Gigante, the two most prominent organized crime figures operating during the same era. At the time he broke his oath and agreed to cooperate, Leonetti was the highest-ranking member of the American Mafia to have made that choice. No one above the position of Underboss in any American family had done what he did. In 1992, a federal judge reviewing Leonetti's cooperation and considering a reduction in his sentence made an observation that the prosecutors who had worked with him later described as the most accurate single assessment of what his testimony had accomplished. The judge told Leonetti he believed the witness would bring down the mob ultimately. The sentence was reduced. Leonetti served 5 years, 5 months, and 5 days in federal custody. He left the witness protection program eventually, moved through several lives in several places, built a business and a family, and an existence that had no connection to South Philadelphia or Atlantic City or anything his uncle had constructed. He appeared in a 1996 television interview wearing a wig and a mustache while standing on the Atlantic City boardwalk where he had spent his childhood, and discussed his uncle and what had happened between them. The interviewer asked how Scarfo felt about what Leonetti had done. He guessed Leonetti said that he would never be dead enough for his uncle. Nicodemo Scarfo died on January 13th, 2017 at the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina. He was 87 years old. He had been in federal custody for nearly 30 years. He had spent the final decades of his life shuffled between institutions, serving sentences that had been designed to ensure he would not leave alive, and he did not. The organization he had built had disintegrated long before him. The Philadelphia crime family never recovered the reach and stability it had held under Angelo Bruno. The construction rackets, the Atlantic City operations, the labor union influence, the integrated economic presence that Scarfo and Leonetti had built on the foundation of the Exile, all of it had been dismantled or prosecuted into irrelevance or simply scattered by the time Scarfo died in that North Carolina medical facility. The family that Bruno had spent 21 years carefully assembling was a diminished and fragmented thing compared to what it had been the night Bruno sat in the front seat of his car on Snyder Avenue. The comparison that makes the Philadelphia story comprehensible is the comparison between two men who ran the same organization according to entirely different theories of what it was for. Angelo Bruno believed that a criminal organization survived by making itself as unremarkable as possible, by taking what the environment offered without drawing the attention that conflict produces, by subordinating the personal volatility of individuals to the organizational requirements of the whole. He ran that theory for 21 years. The men around him resented his patience and believed his restraint was weakness. They were wrong about this, though they would not live long enough to fully understand that they were wrong. Nicodemo Scarfo believed that a criminal organization survived by making itself as feared as possible, by enforcing loyalty through the certainty of violent consequence, by eliminating anyone who might become a problem before the problem could materialize. He ran that theory for 7 years. At the end of those 7 years, 5 of the men closest to him had cooperated with the government. The most damaging of the 5 was the one he had raised from childhood in his own household, and every structure he had built was either convicted or dismantled or running without him. The fear that was supposed to make cooperation impossible had, in the end, produced it. He had created, through the systematic application of his own governing philosophy, exactly the conditions that made his destruction inevitable. He had made the men around him afraid enough to stay. He had made them afraid enough to leave. And the one who left most completely and most consequentially was the one who had known him longest and loved him most completely. Philip Leonetti is still alive. Nicodemo Scarfo is not. The family he left behind never came back. That, in the accounting that matters, is the story.